The casket of Darius Whitmore still sat in the center of the funeral home when his wife Simone placed divorce papers on her lawyer's desk. She believed a dead man could not object, while she claimed the mansion, the company shares, and $30 million in life insurance. Beside her, his mistress's lover, Everett Sloan, smiled like a man who had already won. But as the Reverend prepared to close the service, the doors swung open. Darius walked in alive, holding a signed confession from Everett himself, a document powerful enough to turn a funeral into a crime scene. The Belmont Funeral Home was filled with business partners, senior employees, and people who owed their careers to Darius Whitmore. A walnut casket sat sealed at the center of the hall, closed to viewing because the body inside was said to have been burned beyond recognition in a highway accident on a mountain road. Simone arrived in an expensive black dress, weeping at exactly the right moments, accepting condolences with a composure that felt almost rehearsed. When Reverend Amos Bell prepared to begin the service, Simone pulled attorney Lenora Briggs into a private room and placed a folder on the table, demanding immediate confirmation that the divorce filing had been received. Lenora was stunned, but Simone claimed she had prepared the papers before the accident and simply wanted the record to show the marriage had already ended. The real motive was buried in a clause of the family trust if Darius died while still legally married. Simone would collect the insurance, but controlling shares of the company would transfer into an independent governance fund, whereas evidence that divorce proceedings had already begun could let her argue the shares were disputed marital property and freeze the board's authority. Simone wanted both the payout and the company, and she intended to take them before anyone could stop her. While the two women argued, Everett stood in the hallway pretending to be a grieving chief financial officer, though a brief private glance passed between him and Simone that revealed a connection far beyond business. Lenora refused to sign anything that benefited Simone, and Simone warned that once she took control, she would fire Lenora and sue her for obstruction. The service continued, and Everett stepped forward to deliver a eulogy about his closest friend, claiming Darius had trusted him completely. The moment Everett said Darius would never return, the front doors opened. Darius Whitmore walked in with a wound still healing on his temple dust from the road clinging to his dark coat, and in his hand a waterproof envelope bearing Everett's signature. Simone dropped the divorce papers, and her first instinct was not to run to her husband, but to look at Everett as if silently asking why he was still breathing. Darius saw it happen, and he understood immediately what it meant. He looked at his own casket, then turned to the room and said he was sorry to be late since it seemed his funeral had started without him. Chaos followed instantly. Some guests assumed an imposter had entered, others called for police because a preliminary death certificate had already been issued. Simone recovered her composure quickly and rushed to embrace him in front of everyone. But Darius stepped back, noticing her hands were cold, her breathing steady, nothing about her resembling a woman seeing her husband return from the dead. She announced through tears that the divorce filing had simply been prepared in advance, insisting Darius had neglected her for years and that her heart had already left the marriage. Darius did not argue. He simply asked Lenora to preserve every document Simone had just filed. Everett denied any connection to the envelope, suggesting Darius might be suffering a head injury, hallucinating, or trying to shift blame for the accident onto someone else. But the calm certainty in Darius's eyes never wavered. Guests began edging toward the exit's, phones raised, whispering that the scene resembled a courtroom drama more than a funeral inside a respected Atlanta chapel. A few longtime employees who had worked under Darius for more than a decade tried to shield him from the crowd, forming a loose wall between him and the onlookers who had already started recording. Reverend Amos Bell stood frozen near the pulpit, his prepared eulogy still clutched in one hand, unsure whether to continue the service, cancel it, or simply pray for everyone in the room. Darius asked him gently to step aside for a moment, explaining that whatever happened next needed witnesses, not interruption, and the Reverend lowered himself into the front pew beside a stunned funeral director. The tension thickened with every second Simone hesitated to answer a question. Darius had not yet spoken aloud, though everyone present could feel it hanging over her like a verdict waiting to be read. Darius explained that 3 nights earlier the brakes on his SUV had failed on a mountain road, sending the vehicle off the pavement before he climbed out through a shattered window, moments before it caught fire and dropped into the ravine. Below, injured and without a phone, He had been unconscious for hours, inside an abandoned maintenance station, waking to a radio broadcast announcing his own death, even though rescue crews had not yet recovered a body that could be identified. What struck him most was that Simone had already confirmed his identity based on a watch and a wedding ring recovered from the wreckage items he had not been wearing when the accident happened. Federal agent Rochelle Mercer arrived at the funeral home shortly after sent in response to insurance investigator Graham Holt's report of irregularities in the crash, and she ordered everyone to remain exactly where they stood. Darius handed her the envelope, warning that its contents involved far more than the accident itself, including admissions of embezzlement, forged signatures, and a scheme to seize control of the company. Inside was a 6-page statement bearing Everett's signature and the seal of a notary from Alabama, along with a memory card containing an audio recording of Everett reading the confession aloud in his own voice, a detail that made his denials collapse in real time. Rochelle did not arrest Everett immediately, since the confession still needed verification, and Darius himself remained a person of interest in a possible insurance fraud scheme. Simone seized the opening, telling the gathered crowd that Darius had vanished for days, leaving her to suffer publicly before reappearing like a hero to reclaim everything, and Darius realized in that moment she had prepared a backup story, in case he survived one designed to paint him as the liar. A week before the crash, Darius had discovered that $12.8 million had been siphoned from the company's expansion fund through a network of fake vendors, and only he and Everett held authority to approve transactions of that size. Yet his own signature on the paperwork had been forged. Rochelle checked the company's electronic records and delivered the first real blow of the day, informing Darius that his own account had been used to purchase the exact component later found disabling the brakes of his vehicle, a detail that turned the room's sympathy instantly against him. 2 years earlier, Darius and Simone had been considered one of the most respected power couples among Atlanta's black business community, appearing together at charity galas, industry conferences, and scholarship dinners for adult career training programs. There were no children in the marriage. Both of them had agreed early on to focus entirely on building the company and a foundation dedicated to vocational education for adults. Simone had originally overseen the brand and public image of the business, contributing real value during its early growth. But once the company expanded, the board insisted on separating family involvement from operational authority, leaving her feeling erased from an empire she believed she had helped create. Photographs from those early years still hung in the hallway of the corporate headquarters, showing Simone standing beside Darius at ribbon cuttings, her name printed alongside his on early press releases, her voice quoted in interviews about the values that would define the company culture. She had once believed those years earned her a permanent seat at the table, not a courtesy title handed out to satisfy appearances during charity season. When newer executives, hired for their credentials rather than their history, began taking over the departments she once shaped, Simone told herself the exclusion was temporary, a phase Darius would eventually correct. Once he noticed how much she had sacrificed, he never noticed, not because he stopped caring, but because he had grown so absorbed in expansion contracts and quarterly targets that the quiet resentment building beside him became invisible until it was already too dangerous to reverse. Everett began courting her attention during a stretch when Darius traveled constantly for work, approaching her not with romance but with validation, insisting that she, not her husband, truly understood the company's worth. Their conversations started innocently enough: coffee after board meetings, long calls about strategy that Simone told herself were purely professional, until the attention itself became something she began to crave more than she was willing to admit. He showed her financial projections, claiming Darius intended to transfer most of his shares into a charitable trust, leaving Simone with only a fixed allowance. If he died, a claim that was only partially true since Darius was restructuring assets while still guaranteeing her lifetime benefits. Everett deliberately convinced Simone that her husband was quietly stripping away her future, and she began copying office keys, photographing internal documents, and handing over Darius's secondary passwords, telling herself she was only protecting what belonged to her. The affair began after a company gala, and from that point forward, Everett continually pushed her toward divorce, though Simone understood that under their prenuptial agreement, a standard divorce would limit what she could claim. She could only seize greater control if Darius died, or if he were legally declared incapacitated, and that single realization shaped everything that followed. Back in the funeral home, agents questioned Darius about the brake component purchase, and he explained that the account had been accessed using a backup authentication code stored inside a home safe, a code known only to Simone. She denied it, claiming Darius routinely shared access codes with staff. But Lenora, reviewing the divorce filing more carefully, noticed something unusual. The documents had been signed 2 days before the crash, yet an additional clause had been quietly attached the very morning of the funeral, naming Everett as temporary supervisor of Darius's shares while the marriage's legal status was determined. In other words, Simone was attempting to hand control of the company to her lover, inside the very building where she claimed to be mourning her husband. Darius chose not to reveal everything he knew, wanting Simone to keep believing. Everett was the weakest link in her plan, and he told Everett directly that he had signed the confession not out of guilt toward him, but out of fear of Simone herself. For the first time, a crack appeared between the two conspirators, and Everett leaned close to Simone and whispered that he had not signed to betray her, but because he had learned she intended to have both of them killed. 10 days before the crash, Everett had received an unmarked envelope containing photographs of himself and Simone at a hotel, along with copies of the embezzled transactions, and a printed note warning that after Darius disappeared, Everett would be next. He initially assumed Darius had discovered the affair, but a check of the company's security logs revealed the photographs had been printed from Simone's personal computer, forcing him to consider that she never intended to share the empire at all, only to let him take the blame for the stolen money, before eliminating him as the only remaining witness. Everett spent 3 sleepless nights, turning the discovery over in his mind, replaying every conversation in which Simone had promised him equal partnership once Darius was gone, searching for a hint he might have missed. He remembered small details that once seemed harmless, the way she always steered their plans toward what happened after the funeral, rather than after the divorce. The way she referred to the company as something she alone would inherit, never once using the word we. What had felt like romantic conspiracy began to feel like a countdown clock, ticking toward his own disappearance. And for a man who had spent his career reading financial risk for a living, the pattern was impossible to ignore once he allowed himself to see it clearly. Everett quietly met with a criminal attorney in Birmingham, who advised him to draft a signed statement documenting the entire conspiracy and store it somewhere Simone could never reach. In the confession, Everett admitted to an 18-month affair, the creation of 6 shell companies used to move nearly $13 million, and Simone's role in supplying forged signatures and access codes, along with earlier conversations about incapacitating Darius with medication, before ultimately deciding to stage a fatal accident during a business trip. He confirmed purchasing the brake tampering device through an account fraudulently created in Darius's name and stated he had begun cooperating only after realizing Simone intended to remove him as well. Rather than hand the confession directly to police, fearing his own arrest, Everett locked it inside a safe at a motel managed by someone he trusted. Darius obtained that confession only because Everett found him before rescue crews did a detail he had not yet shared with anyone in the room. After the SUV went off the road, Everett had followed behind to confirm Darius was dead, only to see him crawling out of the ravine alive. He had the opportunity to finish what Simone wanted, but instead brought Darius to the abandoned maintenance station and offered a deal full evidence in exchange for protection from Simone. Darius made no promise of immunity, only that Everett would live long enough to stand trial, and Everett gave him the location of the hidden confession before returning to Atlanta and pretending to believe Darius had died, so Simone would suspect nothing. Rochelle confirmed the signature was authentic, but the confession alone did not prove. Simone had personally ordered the crash, and Simone quickly claimed Everett had acted alone out of greed, hoping to seize the company for himself. Everett reacted furiously, insisting Simone had orchestrated everything from the beginning, and Darius stood between the two, watching two people who had once trusted each other, now racing to destroy one another, before agents received an urgent call from the team, examining the casket, informing them that it was not empty, after Hever. All. Inside lay the body of an unidentified man wearing Darius's jacket, and the funeral home was sealed immediately. The body could not be identified by facial features due to severe burns, but its size matched Darius closely enough that the wedding ring and watch found alongside it had convinced investigators the remains belonged to him. Darius explained he had removed both items before the trip to inspect cargo in a restricted industrial zone, storing them in a locked compartment inside the vehicle, meaning someone else had taken them, and placed them on a different body entirely. That body was eventually identified as Vaughn Kessler, a freelance security specialist who had once worked for Everett, helping build the fake vendor accounts used to steal company funds and disappearing on the exact day of the crash. Records showed Vaughn had grown increasingly nervous in the weeks before his death, telling a former colleague he had taken on a job that felt bigger and more dangerous than anything he had done before, though he never named the people involved. Traffic cameras showed a second vehicle following Darius that morning, later driven back into Atlanta by Everett himself, raising an immediate question: where had Vaughn gone, and how had his body ended up inside Darius's burning car? Everett admitted Vaughn had been hired to disable the vehicle's tracking system and alter its identification data, insisting Vaughn was still alive when the plan began. According to Everett, Simone had ordered Vaughn to drive Darius's car through a toll checkpoint to create the illusion Darius was still behind the wheel, while the real Darius would be held at a warehouse, forced to sign over his assets, and killed afterward. That plan collapsed the moment Darius left earlier than scheduled and unknowingly took the very vehicle that had already been sabotaged. Simone denied ever knowing Vaughn, but Rochelle discovered dozens of calls on Simone's phone to a burner number activated near the warehouse Everett described, and Darius became a suspect in his own right for waiting days before, contacting authorities since he could not be certain which local officers might already be compromised. He revealed that an officer had informed Simone only minutes after the crash site was discovered that no confirmed body had yet been found, information that had never been made public and could only have come from someone inside the department. Lenora then uncovered a clause, buried in the divorce paperwork, filed before the accident, granting Simone full ownership of personal assets. In the event Darius was found to have staged his own disappearance, proof she had prepared for both outcomes long before the crash occurred. When Darius asked Simone whether there had ever been a moment she considered stopping, she told him he had abandoned her long ago, and that she was simply taking what she believed she deserved. And Darius replied that she never wanted half of his life. She wanted him to no longer exist. Insurance investigator Graham Holt, the man whose early suspicion had first brought Rochelle into the case, had flagged the accident days before Darius ever reappeared, noticing that the vehicle's tracking device had been deliberately disabled exactly 17 minutes before the crash occurred. A detail too precise to be coincidence. His original report sat quietly in a claims file until Darius walked through the funeral home doors, and only then did investigators return to it, realizing Graham had been right from the very beginning. Preliminary autopsy results soon revealed Vaughn had not died in the fire at all. He had been poisoned hours before the vehicle ever caught flame, a detail that transformed the entire investigation from financial fraud into calculated murder. Rochelle transported Darius, Simone, and Everett to the Whitmore estate to execute an emergency search warrant, turning the mansion that once symbolized their success into an active crime scene. Agents moved room to room with gloved hands, and evidence markers photographing furniture Simone had chosen herself, artwork Darius had bought on their 10th anniversary, and a wine collection neither of them had touched in over a year. The house that once hosted holiday parties for the entire executive staff now echoed with the sound of latex snapping and radios crackling between federal agents stationed at every exit. Inside the home office, agents found the safe already opened, its authentication devices, share certificates, and insurance documents missing, though Simone insisted Darius could have removed them himself before vanishing. Darius led Rochelle to a hidden compartment behind his bookshelf containing a private backup surveillance system Simone knew nothing about installed, after he first noticed company files being quietly moved without explanation. The footage showed Simone entering the office at 2:13 in the morning 3 days before the crash, accompanied by Everett, opening the safe, using Darius's code, photographing documents, and removing the authentication device, though the silent recording alone could not prove intent to kill. In Simone's dressing room, agents found a black dress still bearing its price tag, purchased 6 weeks before the accident. The same dress she wore to the funeral, its alteration receipt, marked with the words, "Memorial Attire." Beside it hung 2 other dresses in similar shades, each with tags still attached, as though she had shopped for the role of grieving widow, the way another person might shop for a job interview, weighing which version of sorrow would photograph best. A locked drawer held a draft eulogy, created 3 weeks before Darius's crash, describing the burned vehicle and the mountain road, with precise, unsettling accuracy. The strongest evidence yet that Simone had known the stage death was coming. The document had been revised 4 separate times, each version slightly more polished, then the last phrases softened and rearranged the way a speech gets rehearsed before an audience, rather than written in a single moment of raw grief. She fought back by producing an old email in which Darius had once joked that the vehicle would be the death of him someday, alongside a claim that threatening letters had prompted her to prepare for the worst. Everett began to unravel under the pressure, realizing Simone had built every piece of evidence to resemble the anxious preparations of a grieving wife, rather than the blueprint of a murder. Under continued pressure, he finally revealed that Simone frequently met with a man named Travis Boone, who ran a crisis consulting firm specializing in erasing digital footprints, crafting testimony, and controlling public narratives for companies facing scandal. Rochelle located Travis in the system and discovered he had left the state early that same morning, the morning of the funeral. In the garage, agents uncovered a suitcase containing $480,000 in cash, bearing Darius's fingerprints on the handle, which Simone immediately claimed was proof he had planned to flee after staging his own death. Darius stared at the case for a long moment, recognizing it as one he had donated to a company charity auction nearly 2 years earlier. A detail that meant whoever staged this evidence had gone to considerable trouble to make it appear personal and undeniable. He had never packed it, never touched the cash inside it, and had no memory of it leaving his possession. Yet there it sat, positioned exactly where investigators would be certain to find it. When Rochelle pried open the lining, she found a forged passport bearing his photograph, along with a one-way ticket to Belize, evidence carefully planted to complete the frame. Word spread quickly that the man who returned from the dead may have orchestrated the entire accident to defraud his insurer and destroy his wife's reputation. And Simone held a tearful press conference outside the estate, admitting to an emotional relationship with Everett, while insisting she had lived for years inside a marriage built on secrecy and control. By confessing to one smaller sin, infidelity, she made her denial of the larger crime, murder, seem far more believable to a public eager for a simple villain. Reporters crowded the gates of the estate for days, and old photographs of the couple from happier years resurfaced online, framed now as evidence of a marriage that had quietly rotted behind a curated public image. Former colleagues, who had once praised Darius's discipline and vision, began quietly distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with a name suddenly attached to fraud and possible murder. The company board suspended Darius from operations banks, froze corporate accounts, and partner stock values fell within hours, erasing months of steady growth in a single news cycle. Simone did not return to the estate that day, choosing instead to remain in a hotel suite downtown, telling reporters she needed space to process everything happening around her. In the interrogation room, Rochelle laid out the evidence against him piece by piece: the cash-filled suitcase, the forged passport, the brake component purchased under his name, a threatening email sent from his own internal account, and a Proust recording in which his voice appeared to say he wanted to disappear from Simone entirely. The room was small and windowless, a single recorder blinking on the table between them, and for the first time since walking back into his own funeral, Darius felt the full weight of how convincingly his life had been rearranged against him. Darius recognized the recording instantly, as a fragment pulled from a private counseling session where his full statement had actually been about needing a few days apart to help the marriage heal, not to escape it. Forever proof that someone had accessed deeply private records to manufacture his guilt. Lenora traced the leak back to Travis Boone's firm, which had purchased data from a shuttered therapy practice, confirming the frame had been built to destroy Darius even if he somehow survived the crash. Everett, placed under temporary protective custody in a quiet motel room with 2 agents stationed outside his door, spent long hours going through everything he remembered about Simone's habits, searching for anything that might prove useful enough to shorten his own sentence. He recalled that Simone always wore a smart bracelet used to record voice notes while driving, a habit she had picked up years earlier to capture ideas during her long commutes, a detail that could hold conversations between her and Travis. If the cloud backup had not yet been permanently erased, Rochelle discovered the data had been wiped at the exact moment Darius walked into the funeral home, but Darius remembered his own company had once supplied storage infrastructure to the bracelet's manufacturer, and under data dispute regulations, a technical backup could be preserved for 7 days. They had less than 10 hours before that backup would be permanently deleted. Released on limited conditions due to insufficient grounds for formal charges, Darius went straight to the data center with Rochelle rather than returning home. And when Simone learned of this, she called Travis Boone on a line already under surveillance, instructing him to erase the backup, and this time, to make certain Darius was inside the building when it burned. Rochelle chose not to arrest Simone immediately, hoping the surveillance would lead them to Travis and produce direct evidence of a new conspiracy forming in real time. The data center itself sat in a quiet industrial corridor on the edge of the city, its rows of humming servers guarded by a night staff who had no idea their building had just become the target of an arson plot. Darius stood in the control room, watching progress bars crawl across a screen, aware that every minute of delay brought Travis closer, and aware, too, that if the recovery failed, the last real evidence against his wife would vanish, along with it. Agents positioned themselves quietly around the perimeter, watching the access roads while inside technicians worked in near silence. The only sound, the low mechanical hum of machines that held the truth Darius needed. Engineers at the data center located an unsynchronized backup pulled from Simone's bracelet, though decryption would take nearly an hour to complete, and during that wait, Travis appeared at a substation behind the building, carrying an overload device and containers of accelerant. Agents intercepted him before he could trigger the fire, and though he initially refused to speak, learning that Simone had already called him an uncontrolled contractor during her press conference was enough to break his loyalty. In exchange for a deal, Travis handed over the password to his private data archive, and the recovered bracelet audio revealed a conversation between Simone and Everett 6 days before the crash, in which she calmly explained that Darius would die on the mountain road, and if he somehow survived, he would simply become a man who had staged his own death, since she had prepared both versions of the story from the start. A second recording confirmed Simone had ordered Vaughn poisoned after he demanded more money and threatened to go to the police. And though Travis never explicitly admitted to the poisoning himself, his own words about the replacement driver, no longer causing problems, left little doubt. With Simone confirmed as the architect, Travis as the executioner, and Everett as a financial accomplice tied to the vehicle sabotage, Rochelle prepared an arrest warrant. But Darius asked for one final confrontation, not out of vengeance, but to force Simone to admit her motives aloud. They staged a meeting inside the Whitmore Meridian boardroom, telling Simone the recording had been too damaged for use in court, and that Everett was preparing to accept full responsibility in exchange for control of the assets. Believing she could still win, Simone walked in, wearing the same composed elegance she had worn at the funeral, her heels echoing against the polished floor of a boardroom she had once believed would soon belong to her alone. Darius placed the divorce papers on the table, offering to sign immediately if she admitted she had prepared them before the crash specifically to seize company shares. For a moment, she studied him the way she might study a competitor across a negotiating table, calculating whether honesty or denial would serve her better. And then she chose honesty, as if certainty had already replaced fear. She laughed softly, telling him he still thought this was about marriage, when she had turned it into a matter of power long ago, admitting she had used Everett Travis and Vaughn as tools, regretting only that Everett had lacked the nerve to die with the secret intact. Behind Darius, the frosted glass wall of the boardroom slowly turned transparent, revealing Rochelle Lenora and a team of federal agents on the other side, every word Simone had just spoken now captured under a lawful recording order. She did not panic, and instead looked directly at Darius and told him he still had no idea who had actually placed Vaughn's body inside his car. Simone was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and obstruction. Yet, she tried to hold on to one final secret, as leverage, claiming it was Everett, not Travis, who had physically moved Vaughn's body into the vehicle. Everett finally admitted the full sequence of that morning. Vaughn had been waiting at a warehouse near the base of the mountain when Travis drugged his drink, and by the time Everett arrived, Vaughn was unconscious but still breathing. Everett called Simone, who ordered Vaughn placed inside Darius's car to create a body of matching size before the vehicle was pushed into the ravine, and set ablaze a plan. Ruined the instant. Darius changed his schedule and unknowingly drove the very car that had already been sabotaged. Everett and Travis followed behind, believing Darius had died in the crash, and moved Vaughn's body into the burning SUV to ensure investigators would find remains at the scene. With Travis pouring accelerant before leaving, Everett stayed behind long enough to see Darius crawl out of the wreckage alive, and that sighting was the true reason he chose to betray Simone, not out of guilt, but because he needed someone powerful enough to protect him from her. He described watching Darius drag himself away from the burning vehicle, in the dark blood on his face, one arm hanging useless at his side, and admitted that in that moment he understood the weight of what he had already helped set in motion. Rather than finishing what Simone had ordered, Everett made the decision that would eventually unravel her entire plan, choosing survival through cooperation rather than loyalty through silence. He also confessed to taking the ring and watch from the vehicle's storage compartment and placing them on Vaughn's body, the detail that had convinced both police and family that Darius was dead. Every remaining mystery fell into place. Simone had designed the entire plan. Everett had sabotaged the finances and assisted with the vehicle Travis had poisoned. Vaughn and staged the scene, and Vaughn himself had been part of the technical conspiracy before being murdered for demanding too much. Darius had survived only because he escaped the vehicle before the flames spread, and Everett had surrendered the confession purely out of self-preservation. Before being taken away, Simone asked to speak with Darius alone, insisting everything began because she felt invisible inside their marriage, and Darius admitted he had neglected her emotionally for years. He told her plainly that loneliness did not entitle her to forgery, betrayal, and murder, and when she asked if he had ever truly loved her, he said yes, which was exactly why her betrayal cut deeper than any amount of stolen money ever could. 6 months later, the federal trial began, drawing a courtroom filled with reporters, former employees, and curious strangers who had followed every twist of the story since the morning a dead man walked into his own funeral. Everett pleaded guilty to embezzlement, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to sabotage a vehicle, and helping conceal Vaughn's death, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, though still facing years in prison. Travis was convicted of poisoning Vaughn, destroying evidence, conspiring to burn down the data center, and participating in the plot against Darius's life, his sentence stretching well beyond a decade. Simone denied responsibility until the final days of the trial, her attorneys attempting to portray her as a manipulated, wounded wife, an argument that collapsed the moment. Jurors heard her own recorded voice, explaining she had prepared 2 different endings, one for a dead husband and one for a dead husband who somehow lived. Everett's signed confession was not the only evidence that convicted her, but it was the single document that had allowed Darius to survive, return, and unravel the entire conspiracy from the inside. Journalists who had once covered Darius as a rising star in logistics now covered him as a survivor. Though he refused every interview request during the trial, choosing instead to sit quietly in the gallery each day, listening to testimony he had once lived through firsthand. He never spoke to cameras waiting outside the courthouse, never issued a single public statement about his marriage, and let the evidence itself carry every word he might have wanted to say. When the verdict against Simone was finally read, she showed no visible reaction, her expression as composed as it had been the morning she stood beside his casket, in a dress bought weeks in advance. Simone was ultimately convicted of conspiracy to commit murder insurance fraud, embezzlement forgery, and obstruction of justice. And the divorce itself was settled before her criminal sentencing, since no insurance payout could exist for a death that had never actually happened, and any claim to assets tied to her crimes was stripped away entirely. Darius did not pursue everything she once owned. He reclaimed only the stolen funds, his legal costs, and the property directly connected to the conspiracy against him. The Whitmore estate was sold since Darius no longer wanted to live inside the walls that once hid an emptied safe, a planted suitcase, and a eulogy written weeks before he was ever meant to die. Part of the proceeds funded the creation of the Von Kessler Foundation, established to support financial whistleblowers seeking legal protection, a gesture that did not erase Von's crimes, but acknowledged he had been murdered the moment he tried to walk away. Lenora took over as interim chair of the Whitmore Meridian Board during its restructuring, steering the company through months of scrutiny with the same steady discipline that had made her indispensable to Darius long before any of this began. Employees who once feared the company might collapse under the weight of scandal, watched instead as it slowly stabilized, rebuilding trust with partners, one signed agreement at a time. Darius eventually returned to leadership, though he surrendered absolute control, this time building an auditing system that prevented any single person from ever holding that much unchecked power again. He publicly admitted his own failures, admitting he had been too secretive, too consumed by work, and too convinced that silence was a form of strength rather than a slow erosion of trust. A year later, Darius returned to the Belmont funeral home, this time with no casket, no guests, and no cameras waiting outside. The building looked smaller than he remembered the parking lot, nearly empty sunlight falling quietly through tall windows that once framed a room full of grief and suspicion in equal measure. When Reverend Amos Bell asked why he had come back, Darius said he needed to finish a ceremony that had never truly ended, placing a copy of the divorce decree on the very table where Simone had once demanded a signature, an old wedding photograph resting beside it. He did not burn the photograph, and he did not curse her memory. He simply removed the wedding ring, recovered from the crime scene, and set it gently on top of the papers, watching the small gold band catch the light one last time before letting it go completely. He understood now that the day he walked into his own funeral, he had not only proven he was alive, he had also witnessed the true death of a marriage he once believed could still be saved. Reverend Amos told him quietly that some people survive an accident, but still carry the casket with them for years afterward, walking through their days as though half of them never truly climbed out of that wreckage. And Darius answered that he had come back today simply to set it down. He walked out of the funeral home as morning light spread across the front steps, pausing for a moment on the sidewalk, the way a man might pause after setting down something heavy he had carried for far too long. When his phone buzzed with notice that Simone's final sentencing had been formally entered, he looked at the screen for a few seconds before turning it off, without a smile of victory and without a single word of mockery, only the quiet weight of a man walking toward a life no longer built on secrets, betrayal, or fear. In that courtroom, Simone had once asked what had truly caused her downfall, and the answer had nothing to do with Darius being richer, more powerful, or more clever than her. She lost, because while preparing a funeral for her husband, she convinced herself that a man declared dead could never return to tell the truth, and that the people she used to build her plan would stay loyal to her instead of to their own. Survival. Every signature she forged, every dress she bought in advance, every eulogy she rewrote until the wording felt just right, had been built on the same fatal assumption that silence would protect her long enough for the money and the company to to become hers alone. But Darius had lived, Everett had signed, and the very confession two traitors created to protect themselves became the single document that buried their entire conspiracy in the end.